So, Chapter 7 is having a look at the early years of the United States, particularly including the early failure of the Articles of Confederation and the struggles to make the Constitution a more lasting document, and disagreements over the interpretation of said document. So, question 1 was, what were the achievements and problems of the Confederation government? So the Articles of Confederation were drafted by the Second Continental Congress back in 1777. It had functioned really as the government of the revolutionary United States and continued to do so after independence. So the Articles of Confederation were the first government of the United States. The big problem here, though, was that it lacked a strong central government. A lot of the power of governing was given to the states rather than the national government because the framers of this were afraid of giving their new government powers that they had just denied to Britain. So rather than being a strong unifying government, this was more like what they called a firm league of friendship. To get specific about some of the problems, or rather weaknesses, that the Articles had, first of all, their national legislature was only one house, where each state had only one vote, irregardless of the larger populations of some states. So, for example, the population of New York and Virginia combined were greater than the population of all other 11 states combined. And at this one house legislature where each state had one vote, it took 9 out of 13 of these states to pass anything. And that's a higher bar to get over than a simple majority, making passing laws pretty darn difficult. Secondly, there was no executive branch to enforce the laws that were passed by this national legislature, nor was there any kind of national judiciary or national courts to interpret the language and application of the articles. Next, the national government did not have the power to tax or to regulate commerce or any trade or business that's crossing state lines. And this is going to cause some enormous economic problems that are going to be the first to be addressed by critics of the articles. Amendments to try to fix any of these obvious problems required unanimous consent of all 13 states, which made it practically impossible. So even when there seemed to be general consensus of the flaws and weaknesses of the articles, it was simply too difficult to do anything about it in any formal way. So the bottom line is that the Articles of Confederation, in an effort to create a government that better safeguarded individual freedoms and states' rights, ended up creating a national government that was simply too weak to govern and tackle the problems of the new nation. That said, the articles do have some accomplishments. First, it defined how Western lands would be settled. Any Western lands that had been acquired from Britain in the Treaty of Paris could now be divided up into plots and turned into territories and later states on a co-equal basis with the original 13. Now, keep in mind, the area that we're going to be talking about here includes about 100,000 Native Americans who lived there. But as far as the Confederation government was concerned, these Native Americans had no rights to this land because they had sided with the British during the Revolution, and because the British lose, that land is therefore forfeit. But the first law that is a success of the Articles, or the Confederation government, is the Land Ordinance of 1785, and it established patterns of dividing land up into orderly plots. More important though, but building off of the Land Ordinance, was the Northwest Ordinances of 1787, and these laws provided for the orderly creation of new territories and then new states, in particular in the old Northwest that you see here on the map, including Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. A really important element of the Northwest Ordinance that you should note is that it's the first national law in American history to prohibit slavery, because the Northwest Ordinances prohibited slavery in these Northwest territories and the states that they would later become. And this is the first time that we do that at a national legislative level. But of course, the problems of the Articles greatly outweigh the accomplishments that that government had. So they were unable to raise taxes. They could request taxes from the states, but the states were well within their rights to deny those taxes, and they oftentimes did. So they were unable to raise taxes to pay back the debt of the American Revolution, and that included not just paying back the French for assistance, but also paying soldiers pensions for having fought in the war. And as a result, states begin to tax people and issue their own currency to do so. So in order to accumulate tax revenue, because the national government can't do it, states try to take the lead, and in the process, they're coming up with their own economic and monetary systems by printing their own money, and it becomes very confusing. These problems of debt, especially when it comes to uh, paying veterans pension, becomes particularly problematic in an event called Shay's Rebellion. Shay's Rebellion goes from late 1786 to early 1787, and here indebted farmers in Massachusetts by force closed down banks to delay foreclosures on their farms because they couldn't pay back their debts. Many of these individuals were veterans themselves. They were relying on their pensions, which the federal government could not pay, and thus they could not turn around and pay the payments on the land that they had purchased on loans from the bank. So they're hoping to close the banks temporarily to shore up their finances so they can pay for their land, but they do this by force. The rebellion is eventually put down, but by essentially hired soldiers by the state government, because the national government simply did not have the ability to quell this violence. And it's going to be that helps to convince many leaders of the need for a stronger national government. Not only were the problems of the Articles of Confederation responsible for the outbreak of the rebellion, but weaknesses of the Articles prevented the government from easily putting the rebellion down. Now, fortuitously, Shay's Rebellion occurs between occurs between the Annapolis Conference and a proposed convention in Philadelphia. The Annapolis Conference was called to consider changes to the Articles of Confederation to try to address its flaws, but the Annapolis Convention was very poorly attended. So they kind of scheduled a further meeting to try again in Philadelphia, and Shay's Rebellion happens in between those two, and it is very influential and persuasive in getting states to send their delegates to Philadelphia to try to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. Number two, what major disagreements and compromises molded the final content of the Constitution? So delegates from the states after Shay's Rebellion are going to meet privately in Philadelphia in 1787 in what will come to be called the Constitutional Convention. Most of these guys were wealthy, they were college educated, they were all men. So keep in mind that the people drafting this new framework of government are not average citizens. So while they claim to derive their authority and the Constitution to derive its authority from the people, these folks represent a minority of the population at the time. Their goals were to strengthen national authority and to try to curb what they called the excesses of democracy. Keep in mind that they wanted the nationalists here are going to want a republic, but many of them see democracy as something of a bad word. They tend to associate democracy with chaos and mob rule and violence. So they saw Shay's Rebellion as democracy, and they want to avoid such excesses of democracy in the future by creating a stronger national government. They agreed on a number of things moving in, particularly on the structure of what the new national government should be. They thought there should be a legislature, but they also thought that they should make sure that they have an executive and a national judiciary this time around. And they also believed that this new national government should be able to tax and to regulate commerce. And those were two huge flaws with the Articles of Confederation. The first disagreement, though, has to do with how should states be represented in the new national legislature. Now, before, there had been one house and all states had been represented equally. Large states with larger populations saw that as unfair, and thus a very populous state Virginia, is going to propose the Virginia Plan, where representation in the national legislature would be based on population, thus favoring large states. Now, small states are afraid that they will be outvoted here and they will lose their equal state status if that's the way they're going to represent the states. So the New Jersey plan represents the interests of small states, and it proposed equal representation again. Ultimately, this is settled by the Connecticut Compromise or Great Compromise, wherein we create a bicameral or two-house legislature where one house, the House of Representatives, is based on population, whereas the other house, the Senate, will be based on equal representation. So the House reflects the Virginia plan and the Senate reflects the New Jersey plan. Now, the new structure that they're creating here, though, is less than democratic. Keep in mind that the House of Representatives, although that was directly elected by the people, no other part of the national government would be. At the time, before we amended the Constitution much later on, the Senate, or rather senators, were chosen by state legislatures, not by the people in a direct vote. And then the president's not chosen by the people, he's chosen or elected by the Electoral College. And then the national judiciary, like the Supreme Court and the federal courts, they're not voted in, they're chosen by the president, who's not voted on by the people, and even at that, the president has to get the permission of the Senate, who is elected by state legislatures, not the people, to actually have those judges take their position. They're trying to insulate much of the national government from what they see as the excesses of democracy by putting ultimately very little power in the hands of the people, because the House of Representatives of the two houses of Congress is the weakest half. What they're creating is a federal system. A federal system will strengthen the national government, but will refer to a roughly equal relationship between a national government and then the many state governments. The new government, the new stronger national government, would theoretically be limited in its exercise of power through separation of powers and checks and balances. Separation of powers gives the basic powers of government, the power to make the law, the power to enforce it, and the power to interpret it, into three separate branches. So here, the power to write the law is the legislative branch, or Congress. The power to enforce the law is the executive branch, or the president. And the power to interpret the law is the judicial branch, or the Supreme Court and the many federal courts. Checks and balances is going to allow each of these branches of government to do something to limit the power of the other. So both of these are intended to ensure that no branch of the government becomes too powerful, because if that were to happen, a minority faction could take control of just that one branch of government and then overpower the rest of the population by operating government to their benefit at the disadvantage of everybody else. Importantly, the Constitution does not contain the word slave or slavery, but it clearly enshrines this institution in the new government. So in the Constitution, they're going to prohibit Congress from abolishing the slave trade for 20 years. They will require states to return fugitive slaves to their owners. And then they're going to recognize and enshrine the institution of slavery by having them slaves counted toward a state's population as 3/5 of a person. So slave states wanted slaves to be counted toward their population in order to increase their representation in Congress, like in the House of Representatives. Northern, mostly non-slave states opposed this. Ultimately, the compromise is slaves would be counted, but only 3 out of every 5 would be counted toward population. So it's not a equal representation there to dramatically boost Southern power, but it does count them. Well, count 3/5 of them, and that adds to Southern power. So both sides ultimately can be happy with this so-called 3/5 compromise. Number 3, how did anti-federalist concerns raised during the ratification process lead to the creation of a Bill of Rights? So the Constitution states that it could only go into effect when 9 out of 13 states had ratified or approved it in state conventions. Supporters of ratification in the new federal system were called Federalists, and Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, all Federalists, published the Federalist Papers. It's a collection of essays that were intended to convince delegates at the state conventions to vote to ratify it. Generally, they're arguing that a stronger national government would actually protect liberty, not threaten it. If you were to look at, say, Federalist 10, it argued that a large republic would mean lots and lots of competing groups, and as a result, no one of them could control government and oppress the rest. Furthermore, in Federalist 51, they argue that the separation of powers and checks and balances would prevent government from becoming tyrannical. So these essays are effectively trying to assuage fears over the creation of a new, stronger national government that some believed might actually threaten liberty rather than protect it. And these critics were called anti-federalists because they opposed ratification of the Constitution that would create a federal system. So anti-federalists, generally speaking, feared a powerful national government would threaten people's liberty, and they pointed specifically to a lack of a Bill of Rights to protect things like speech, religion, the press, and so on. Now, state constitutions had bills of rights, but they didn't necessarily protect you from the action of the national government, which is why they want a Bill of Rights at the national level to restrict the power of the national government to violate your liberties. And that's how we get the Bill of Rights. So Federalists in their negotiations promise a Bill of Rights after the Constitution is ratified, or an addition of several amendments that would explicitly protect basic liberties like speech, press, religion, and so on. This was intended to assuage anti-Federalist fears and to secure its ratification. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. An amendment is an addition or change to the original document. And again, they include things like freedom of speech, the press, assembly, so on and so forth. Number 4, how did the definition of citizenship in the new republic exclude Native Americans and African Americans? So Native Americans and African Americans were not included as citizens. Native Americans, white Americans generally agreed that westward expansion should continue despite the presence of large populations of Native Americans. The new government will agree, though, that land acquisition needed to happen by way of a treaty. You couldn't just theoretically take the land. You would have to actually sign a treaty with native tribes to acquire their land. This is according to a law called the Indian Intercourse Act in 1790. It's an important one because when we get rid of it, things get worse. So you should remember that one. So the Indian Intercourse Act recognized the sovereignty of Native Americans in theory, but these treaties that were required were oftentimes negotiated under duress, or with only a small portion of the tribe. In other words, these treaties were typically negotiated and agreed upon unfairly, but still therefore theoretically within the bounds of the law. Resistance to westward expansion, at least in the Northwest Territory, was led by a Native American with the fierce name of Little Turtle, who was actually a lot more fearsome than his name might indicate. He's finally defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which will result in the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. That's going to cede or give up most of Ohio and Indiana to white settlers. So again, it follows the Indian Intercourse Act because they take the land via treaty, but it's done under duress because they have fought a war to force Little Turtle and his alliance to sign such a treaty. Now, some, like Thomas Jefferson, called for a policy not of extermination and expulsion, but rather one of assimilation, that Native Americans should be encouraged to adopt effectively white ways, white culture, practices, become small farmers, own slaves, etc., in order to survive. And this assumed that Native Americans could become civilized by adopting white culture, and like any assimilationist policy, it also assumes the inferiority of one culture, because to improve, quote unquote, they would have to assimilate or adopt the practices and behaviors of a allegedly superior civilization, in this case, the whites. As for African Americans, the Naturalization Act of 1790, which defined citizenship in the early republic, explicitly restricted citizenship to, quote, free white persons, end quote. So African Americans, be they slave or free, were definitionally not citizens. There was the widespread assumption that African Americans were inferior to whites, and that is certainly an obstacle to citizenship and certainly to freedom for slaves. And worth noting that although we're beginning to see greater calls for emancipation or abolition of slavery, they are still very much in the minority. And when you do see them, they're usually coupled with calls for relocation. So slaves should be freed, but then should be sent to Africa or the Caribbean or somewhere else. And that assumes that African Americans are so inferior that they could not even assimilate into white society, and it would thus be better for them to not be here at all. So the early republic is forming after the failure of the Articles of Confederation. They've created a stronger national system with the Constitution, but neither of these governments recognize really anyone beyond white men as being full citizens of the republic. This predictably is going to cause conflicts in the future and a long period of adjustment, which we arguably have yet to complete, to live up to the founding ideals of this country and the idea that all men are endowed with certain rights by their creator and all men are born equal.